The Canadian ice patches do not wait for discovery, they reveal themselves slowly, like whispers rising from silence. Each thawing ridge carries fragments of lives long gone, fragments bound in wood, sinew, and stone. This is not a museum collection assembled from dust, it is a story frozen in place, waiting 10,000 years for its telling. The beginning is not in our present, but in a world of cold wind, where hunters climbed the ridges to follow the caribou. Their world was not abstract history, it was immediate survival. In their hands rested weapons of astonishing design, atlatls, designed to extend human reach into the great distances of the tundra. A man stands on a ridge, his eyes sharp against the light of an endless sky. He holds the atlatl with familiarity born from practice, his grip steady even as the wind presses against him. The herd below shifts and turns, animals breathing steam into the morning, unaware of the silent figure above. Every step he takes is deliberate, his weight balanced to quiet the snow beneath. He inhales once, then again, as though syncing his body to the rhythm of the herd's movement. In those breaths lies the tension of survival, for a single mistake means hunger for those waiting at his camp. The atlatl is not much to look at, a carved piece of wood fitted with a hook to hold the dart. Yet within its design lies genius, a mechanical advantage that turns human effort into a force far greater. It represents a leap that extended human capacity to hunt, a revolution dressed in simplicity. Picture the hunter as he raises the atlatl, aligning his dart in silence, weight shifting across his shoulders. His gaze follows the chosen animal, a young caribou slowing at the edge of the herd. The world around him narrows to a single instant, his body coiled between patience and release. Not every throw strikes true, and sometimes a dart skims the snow, bouncing into drifts that swallow it whole. A weapon like this vanishes in seconds, covered by a shifting veil of frost. What is lost to the hunter in frustration becomes, unseen, the beginning of preservation. Snow and ice settle, layering through seasons, pressing the object deeper into stillness. Where soil would decay wood, here frost denies every rot, holding fragile fibers as if in sleep. The object waits, hushed beneath centuries of silence, immovable while generations pass above. These accidental preservations are why Canadian ice patches are so extraordinary. They offer us something Earth rarely spares: organic relics once easily broken, now intact after 10 millennia. They present not an echo but a voice, strong enough to speak across ages. When archaeologists walk into these melting patches today, they are not simply looking for evidence, they are retrieving moments. A dart shaft in their hands is a story still in the middle of action. One can imagine the throw, the chase, the shout, as if the scene were only paused until now. The patches themselves are smaller than glacier, scattered across mountain slopes like forgotten mirrors. They persist because they balance sun and shadow, storing cold where it cannot fade. Caribou know them instinctively, drawn each summer to escape swarms of insects in the open valleys. Animals gather here, the ground pocked by hooves pressing into snow. Wherever they gather, humans have always followed. Thus the ice patches are not remote by chance, they are magnets of life, crossroads where survival was staged year after year. For indigenous communities, these grounds held both resource and rhythm. They were places where knowledge carried from one generation to the next shaped the decision of where and when to hunt. This was no random chance but practiced understanding, a choreography of human movement with animal habit. Every recovered spear or atlatl fragment is evidence of this continuity, of mind shaping tools and children repeating instructions. Knowledge did not rest in books, it lived in actions repeated until ingrained. Even now, the objects discovered speak of that memory, whispering lessons of survival etched into wood. To feel the weight of one such object today is to sense more than craftsmanship. In the grooves of wood and the twist of sinew bindings lies the presence of hands, gestures, and instructions. The past has not disappeared, it is there, lightly touching the present with the persistence of survival. But this insight comes at a cost, for each artifact exposed is at risk. Ice is both guardian and betrayer, preserving until it releases, then quickly letting decay begin. Once wood, leather, or hide touches air, time resumes its ancient work of breaking things apart. The urgency is felt by archaeologists who arrive with brushes, vials, and careful hands. They step gently over melting patches, knowing that what is seen today may be gone tomorrow. Their work is a race, not against discovery, but against loss. Imagine one such archaeologist kneeling on the snow, lifting a dart shaft into view. Its surface still bears the polish of ancient handling, as though it was dropped only yesterday. For an instant, the gap of 10,000 years collapses between human hands. This is not archaeology that feels distant or cold. It is immediate, intimate, filled with presence. The frozen ground offers its memories one by one, and we become listeners to a conversation continued after millennia of pause. These memories remind us where our ingenuity began. The atlatl does not belong merely to one culture or one land, variation sprang across continents, each echoing the same idea. Human beings learn to extend body and force with wood, string, and skill. What these Canadian finds emphasize, however, is the detail so often erased elsewhere. Here we have not just stone tips but the shafts, bindings, and even the wear of use. They are entire tools, whole systems of design, frozen into clarity as few places in the world can provide. Every find reinforces how hunters adapted to climate, geography, and necessity. A shaft shaped slightly thicker, a cord wound tighter, a tip napped at a sharper angle. Nothing was wasted or accidental, everything arose from generations of refinement. In these crafted weapons we see the mind of the maker, the persistence of trial and error, the love of precision. They are achievements no less intellectual than writing or architecture, for here design meant survival. They are books written in wood and sinew, and every discovery is a recovered page. The ice patches become a library few expected, shelves of frozen memory stacked in ridges of snow. The volumes are fragile, released when the binding of ice melts away. Archaeologists read quickly, line by line, before the pages vanish once more into dust. The backdrop of all this is the immense span of time itself. 10,000 years means these hunters lived before the great monuments of stone were ever built, before cities rose, before history as we know it. Their world is older than our traditions, and yet it remains familiar through their tools. To grasp an atlatl shaft is to connect across that unimaginable distance. A hunter's hand placed it down, an archaeologist's hand lifts it up, and between them flows all of human endurance. The ice has carried it across the gulf like a messenger, whispering continuity through silence. This story matters because it places us within that chain. The same thought, the same cunning, the same reliance upon nature is alive in us still. These relics remind us that even in vast difference of years, the pulse of survival beats in the same rhythm. And so, as one listens, the Canadian ice patches change from remote geography into theater. Here animals move like currents, hunters align their stance against cold winds, and tools descend into drifts that will cradle them for eons. Time bends, and we stand watching alongside them. The scene holds silence, the kind only snow can give, deep and heavy, broken only by the crackle of frost. In that silence lies the durability of memory, a pause that stretches longer than civilization itself. To listen to it is to breathe in the continuum of humanity. It is this silence that the sleep of ice protects most faithfully. It is this silence that we now enter as listeners, as if lying down beside ancient fires, closing our eyes while stories are repeated across flames. The ice patches are, above all, a promise that nothing is truly lost if we wait long enough. When you rest and allow these stories to wash through, you step into that corridor of frozen time. You hear footsteps on stone ridges, the breath of animals in cold air, the release of a dart. You hear the echoes sealed in frost for millennia, still unfolding. And so, the Canadian ice patches stand as frozen hunting grounds from 10,000 years ago, but also as mirrors set against the present. They remind us of how fragile objects can still carry voices, how silence can still be full of sound. If you listen carefully, you will hear them. This is where the documentary begins, not in definitions or dry numbers, but in the resonance of a hunter's breath in the cold air, a dart vanishing into snow, and the certainty that stories are waiting beneath the ice. The rest will follow, slowly, as the ice itself reveals more. The ice is never silent for long, because every melt uncovers what it once chose to protect. What appears at first to be nothing more than a trickle of water sliding down a ridge suddenly reveals the tip of wood, the carved edge of bone, the faint trace of sinew. These are not fragments of decay, but living shapes of tools, intact and clear, reborn into daylight from centuries of enclosure. To look closely at one of these emerging relics is to realize how fine the preservation is. The cord of animal tendon still wound tightly against a shaft, the smoothness of polished wood answering back to the human hand that carved it. There are even impressions of pressure where fingers once pressed, frozen details of use held intact through millennia of cold. It is astonishing to remember that such materials should never have survived. In every other setting, wood and hide fall apart, dissolve into earth, and leave only ghost traces in the form of stone tips. Yet here in the Canadian ice, the earth holds up its rebellion against forgetting by wrapping even fragile threads inside a chamber of frost. The balance is so precise that we receive not tokens, but whole instruments. The place itself reveals why. High ridges catch the snow, curving bowls of earth that capture winter storms and lock them in pockets shielded from summer's heat. The result is not moving glacier but steady patches, patches that breathe cold even when the valleys below turn green. Hunters long ago knew these zones, and animals knew them too, forming a meeting ground where chance becomes tradition. When herds of caribou sought shelter from insects in summer, they spread across these patches, their hooves pressing down the snow into a worn, steady rhythm. People followed, knowing where herds would cluster, where the chances of meat and hide were highest. The ridgeways became maps not drawn in lines but walked year after year, roots inherited the way stories are inherited. This repetition forged the hunting grounds into constants. Every constant risks loss of weaponry and tool, for hurried moments in the frenzy of a hunt often make space for accidents. In the pursuit, a dart might fracture as it strikes bone, or tumble into drifts with no time to retrieve. What falls here, in this unusual landscape, finds itself carried not to decay but to suspension. The cold air closes over it with remarkable gentleness. When archaeologists began uncovering these sites, they knew at once what rarity they had touched. The old tools were not imagined reconstructions, but tangible, usable items, preserved better than any soil-bound find. With them came understanding not only of technology, but of hunting patterns, seasons, and habits. These were not just tools, they were coordinates on a map of survival. Some finds astonish in their immediacy, as when a slender dart shaft emerges, looking as if it might still be launched from an atlatl today. Others reveal the artfulness of binding and joining, sinew pulled tight, resin sealing the grip against wood. Details that textbooks can only guess at appear plainly, waiting for new eyes to appreciate what ancient hands already knew. There are darts as old as 8,000 years, their wood dark with age yet flawless with preservation. There are leather fragments, still supple at discovery but quick to dry if not gathered at once. There are bone splinters sharpened into points, proof that nothing was wasted, that every part of an animal could pass into human design. The ice held them all in reserve, offering them as evidence when the time became fragile enough to need them again. For the people living then, none of this was fragile, it was immediately real. The hunt dictated life, and the caribou gave more than meat. It gave hides for shelter, bones for tools, tendons for bowstrings and bindings. To hunt was to gather the elements of life itself, combining craft with resourcefulness, turning every fragment of animal into survival. In camps nearby, families waited with fires kindled, listening for the return of hunters. The rhythms of survival were clear: the chase, the preparation, the sharing of food, the reinforcement of knowledge. Each return from the patches meant both sustenance and teaching, because younger eyes watched every movement of older hands, learning where to stand, when to wait, how to launch the dart as if extending one's breath into the distance. Now, when modern researchers kneel on the same ground, they step into that circle of continuity. They see the same ridges, feel the same cold air, and recognize the wisdom behind the old roots. Though the distance of years is unimaginably wide, the impression is one of closeness, as though the ice has narrowed the distance instead of widening it. The wonder of these discoveries is matched by their urgency. As the climate warms, the ice that once preserved begins to release, spilling its contents faster than hands can gather them. Every melt exposes treasures, yet also threatens their destruction, the moment air touches hide or sinew, undoing thousands of years within hours. What has been guarded so faithfully finds itself in peril at the moment of rediscovery. This paradox drives science with a fever of care. Helicopters carry archaeologists over ridges in short windows of summer, their eyes searching constantly for dark lines against snow, for signals of hidden shafts or bones emerging. Each hour matters, each discovery is placed quickly in conservation, racing against the forces of warmth and wind. It is a balance not unlike the ancient hunt itself, a test of speed, attention, and precision. Yet even within this urgency, there remains awe. To be the first person to lift a weapon untouched for thousands of years, to feel the wood that answered an ancient craftsman's pressure, is to stand in a communion deeper than scholarship. It is intimacy across continents of time. No lecture captures the humbling sensation of holding in your hand an object that last served life in an age when glacier still rimmed the land. And always, each artifact reminds us that these tools were not anonymous. They were made by specific hands, shaped with care, polished with intention. The shafts bear individuality, the bindings reveal particular habits of tying. They are personal signatures frozen not in ink but in practice, testaments to culture as much as to survival. Through these ice patches, modern societies reconnect not just to prehistory, but to continuity with indigenous knowledge. Oral traditions of First Nations communities have long described the rhythms of caribou, the patterns of hunting through valleys and ridges that match what the ground yields now. The discoveries do not invent new stories so much as confirm what memory already preserved. It is a weaving together of voice and object, of story and shaft, each strengthening the other. One can imagine listening in the darkness of a camp long ago, a child learning how a dart is bound, how weight is balanced. The same child years later binds his own weapon, practicing throws that will feed his people. In the continuity of those actions lies culture, a stream of unbroken adaptation. To stand in the present and witness it re-emerge is to feel that you too are part of its current. In this unfolding of history, the ice patches remind us that all time is fragile. What we regard as past continues to move toward us, surfacing unexpectedly, placing questions into our hands. To see such complexity sealed in wood and hide is to realize how much has been forgotten elsewhere, erased by decay. These patches become guardians not of rarity, but of truth. Their truth is both simple and profound. The story is of humans adjusting to conditions with creativity, meeting needs defensively and beautifully. It is of hunters building new extensions of their arm to reach further, to strike deeper, to assure the survival of those behind them. And it is of nature, the cold mountain winds, accepting what was dropped and preserving it with infinite patience. Even now, as listeners follow this path in their imagination, they walk beside those hunters. The snow crunches beneath their feet, the air cuts sharp and clean, distant animals cluster into herds shimmering in the light. A hunter raises his atlatl, breath slows, muscles tighten, a dart arcs high into the silence, and the world pauses at the edge of memory. That pause is what the ice patches have stretched across millennia. It is not truly broken even now. We step into it simply by listening, by imagining, by picturing the frozen ridges not as empty but as crowded with memory. The frozen hunting grounds speak, returning us to the stillness where all stories begin. What lies ahead in this journey through ice is more than archaeology. It is reflection upon continuity, upon the movement of animals and humans stitched tightly together by necessity. It is the recognition that survival is both ordinary and astonishing, requiring tools, knowledge, patience, and trust. The ice shows us each piece, preserved like lessons, ready to be learned again. As you rest and drift further into this unfolding narrative, the snowfields open around you. Distant ridges glow soft with light, the ice holds its stories close, releasing them in fragments that float across your thoughts. In quiet repetition, the fragments join, forming the long unbroken chain of 10,000 years, drawing you deeper into the rhythm of the frozen grounds. The rhythm is patient, almost timeless. Hunters rise, hunters follow, animals move. Animals return, snow falls, snow lingers. Each action turns into pattern, each pattern turns into memory, and the ice holds onto it all, gently, as though it were protecting not just objects but life itself. You hear it even now, soft beneath the surface, steady as a heartbeat older than history. The atlatl waits at the center of this story, a simple extension of wood that magnified strength into distance and accuracy. To imagine it is to imagine more than a weapon. It is to picture a bridge between ordinary human movement and extraordinary reach. This slender shaft, often overlooked by time, permitted hunters of the northern ice to balance delicacy with power in a way unmatched for thousands of years. Its design is both elegant and ancient, a lever using the law of force to extend the arm. With a dart slotted into the hook, the thrower's arm no longer worked alone, it became part of a larger mechanism. The atlatl stored energy in its swing, then released it into a dart that could travel further, with deadlier speed, toward the unsuspecting caribou in the distance. The brilliance lies in how human culture reads nature itself. Just as a branch bends and releases, so the atlatl resembles trees in the wind, gathering momentum, freeing it in a sudden arc. Hunters copied this truth unconsciously, turning patterns of the natural world into craft. The result was nothing less than an invention that multiplied possibility. When archaeologists retrieved preserved atlatls from the Canadian ice, they read not only the story of invention, but the fingerprints of its maker. A groove carved deeper here, a binding placed tighter there, each detail individual. Such variation reminds us that technology was not abstract, it was personal, born of hands that shaped, adjusted, and trusted their work beneath open skies. To throw with an atlatl required knowledge of rhythm more than brute force. A hunter learned balance through practice, the timing of steps, the flex of the dart, the pull of a shoulder. It was an art as much as a weapon's use, and one that wove entire bodies into its performance. Efficiency was survival, and survival depended on listening to the whisper of movement. One can almost close their eyes and picture him poised in stillness, dart aligned in silence, a breath caught at the edge of an inhale. The herd drifts, unaware, every sound muffled by the cushion of snow beneath hooves. Then the dart arcs, a line drawn not against paper but across air, vanishing into the living motion of the hunt. What ancient hunters discovered in that motion was a new sense of reach. For thousands of years, humans had pursued prey with thrusting spears, forcing closeness, demanding physical risk. With the atlatl came distance, safety, and a wider horizon of possibility. It stretched the boundaries of interaction with the great animals of the north. And the prey itself shaped this interaction. Caribou herds, massive yet skittish, required weapons that could strike before their wide movement scattered them. Close ambushes risked failure against so many watchful eyes, but reach and speed offered advantage. In this balance of animal instinct and human response, the atlatl thrived as an answer. It is tempting to imagine the object as purely functional, yet the elegance of design may have carried beauty too. Carvings on surviving atlatls from across the world suggest decoration mattered. Each hunter may have etched his own marks, symbols of meaning, identity, spirit. These vanished or remain faint, but the idea lingers of weapons carrying more than function. They may have been companions. To modern eyes, the atlatl feels simple, yet to the hunter it was an extension of self. To delegate part of strength to a crafted lever meant trusting wood as though it were muscle. This trust creates intimacy, a union of maker and tool. The discovery of intact shafts from ice is thus more than technological, it is emotional connection across worlds of time. Pieces recovered from the Canadian patches astonished scientists because they provided the missing half of story. Before, reliance had been on stone tips, bare flakes left behind long after their shafts dissolved. The imagination filled in what was lost, sketches drawn from fragments. Now, whole artifacts emerged, telling the story in full sentences instead of broken syllables. These sentences describe both continuity and change. They show how indigenous nations of the North crafted not in isolation but in dynamic evolution, adapting their designs to herds, to seasons, to lessons learned in generations of struggle. No culture stood still in frozen lands, every throw refined understanding, every winter taught endurance. The atlatl carved human time into repeatable patterns. Each hunt deepened the motion in memory, muscle remembering what had succeeded before. Shared across families, these repetitions became the grounding of knowledge, the unseen script of culture written not with words but with repeated throws across frozen air. As ice reveals these tools again, we hear those scripts as echoes. In dark museum drawers lie shafts wrapped carefully against decay, their fibers ancient yet delicate. Each once flew across grey winter light armed with the faith of the hunter who shaped it. Preserved now, they are like voices paused, waiting for listening ears. That listening is not abstract but deeply visceral, because the atlatl is still usable. Modern experimenters taking replicas stand again in that posture, arm lifted, dart notched, release sharp. The sound is the same, the flight is the same, the sensation of distance gained is the same. 10,000 years collapse into one moment of recognition. Carved shafts from the ice remind us that invention is never random. Human hands pushed the limits of survival by seeing leverage, feeling momentum. What may look to us like accident was in reality meticulous craft, unbroken lines of trial and success. Survival was not chance, it was design. In every recovered fragment, historians trace storylines of design adjusting to culture. Some are thicker for resilience, some lighter for speed, some balanced to compensate for the winds across ridges. Each adaptation reveals intelligence honed by necessity. Function fused with environment in a manner precise enough to feel modern. And always, behind each discovery, persists the image of hunters in flow with their world. Breath moving in rhythm, dart carrying weight of life, footsteps marking frozen ground. The scene is humble and yet resonates across centuries because it is entirely human, entirely universal. It is a reminder that ingenuity rose as naturally as breath. Ice continues to offer these reminders in silence. With every thaw, slivers of wood dark with age slip from snowbanks, lying fragile against melting streams. Archaeologists reach quickly, capturing what air would soon dissolve. Their urgency is devotion, an unspoken promise to rescue ancient hands from sudden oblivion. What they uncover binds us closer to ancestors than stone ever could, because stone speaks of permanence while wood speaks of intention. A shaft carved and polished reflects decision, measure, and skill. It whispers not of eternity but of effort, reminding us that what survives longest is, paradoxically, what was always meant to vanish. The paradox deepens the fascination. These tools, never expected to persist, return only because of the ice, and only now because the ice recedes. They might have lingered eternally unseen, locked away forever in purity of cold. Instead, their return ties us to the present crisis of change, a gift bound with warning. Thus each tool cradled by gloved hands is more than evidence. It is a message that the world is shifting, that time once frozen is speaking once again. The hunters may not answer, but their tools have returned at precisely this moment, as though reminding us of our place within cycles too large to control. And within these cycles lies the heart of human creativity, always turning constraint into change. The atlatl proves this in every detail, for it arose not from comfort but from need. Where prey moved swiftly across open lands, hunters demanded greater reach. Where cold demanded precision, they crafted tools to match. Innovation was not choice but law. The Canadian ice patches tell this law in their secrets. Every artifact is a witness, silent yet eloquent, threading human ingenuity into the permanence of snow. As listeners let their thoughts drift over this scene, they feel not distance, but closeness, hands shaping wood, breaths pausing before release, eyes watching herds against white landscapes. The silence of the ice deepens, carrying you within it. The atlatl does not rest solely in history, it rests in imagination, inviting you to hold it still, to feel weight and balance as though time were transparent. And in that weight lies the unbroken strength of hunters who lived, labored, and endured. Though the journey moves forward, their presence surrounds us, captured in every rediscovered weapon that the cold has selflessly saved. The echoes continue, carried in frost, reminding us that survival has always been shaped by ingenuity, and that ingenuity leaves behind voices strong enough to speak through a 10,000-year silence. The routes the hunters followed were not born from maps or spoken lines, but from instinct carried forward in memory. Each ridge, each snow field, became familiar by repetition, walked so many times that the path imprinted itself upon the people who traveled them. These hunting trails were less roads than flowing rhythms, part of the land's pulse, guiding hunter and herd in an endless spiral of return. Along these icy valleys, caribou moved with a precision that was almost clockwork. They traced ancient corridors, following corridors of wind, shelter, food, and seasonal promise. The hunters knew this inevitability, waiting in places where the animals would always come, reading the landscape like one reads the return of seasons or sun. The mountains themselves became living witnesses to this movement. Each slope carried a memory of the herds, each ridge echoed with hoofprints muffled by snow, each shadow lay across ground where people stood to watch. To understand survival here was to understand the logic of migration, to know when the animals would appear, and to be ready before they vanished again. It is impossible to separate these routes from the hunters themselves, for they were entwined. The routes were more than geography, they were cultural inheritance, mapped not by lines scratched in earth, but carved into minds and repeated in story. The act of walking them was education, each footstep both survival and tradition. In camps, the knowledge flowed across generations. Elders described the way a herd's breath would rise in the colder morning, teaching youths where to listen for muffled hooves crossing snow. Hunters taught not by lecture but by demonstration along the routes, pointing to valleys, ridges, ice fields, each feature carrying instruction. These words shaped movement, embedding memory deeper into the ground itself. When artifacts are discovered in Canadian ice patches today, they reaffirm this invisible map. These were not misplaced tools in random environments, they were lost in specific trails where prey and people converged. The ice patches align with the known migration paths of animals, showing us a clarity of pattern across time like constellations across night skies. The truth becomes clear, roots were arteries of survival. They tied life across the mountains, feeding communities, maintaining stability from unknown centuries to the next. Hunters walked them not with a sense of exploration but with certainty, confident that the shared motion of animal and human was the law of return. Listen closely and you can almost hear it. The muffled rhythm of hooves stamping ice, the careful crunch of human footsteps balancing weight on snow. For hours and days these movements intertwined, two rhythms echoing across the ridges until the wind folded them into silence once again. In the practice of following routes, hunters built a relationship with the landscape that transcended mere use. They became attuned to the smallest variations, the drift of a snowfield changing slope, the arrival of green sprouts that touched the frozen crust, the shifting presence of ravens that often marked animal trails. The ground itself spoke when one knew how to listen. Every generation repeated this learning, ensuring continuity stronger than writing. A map drawn on hide could fade, but a path walked year after year imprinted knowledge upon minds. In this way the roots remained alive, flexible to change yet anchored in steady familiarity. Each hunter carried them not on parchment but in heart. To outsiders these mountains might appear endless, confusing, indistinguishable in their whiteness. To those who lived here, they were patterned, layered with meanings, textured with cues invisible to untrained eyes. The landscape was never empty. It was dense with messages waiting to be read by those who carried the memory of ancestors moving here before. Modern explorers tracing these tracks sense the depth of this knowledge. Archaeologists may walk with GPS and instruments, but their sense merges with ancient guidance, recognizing that location is not arbitrary. Tools emerging in melting ice confirm where people once stood, where herds once turned, where waiting gave birth to moments of survival. The feeling is uncanny, standing where footprints are gone but tools remain. One gazes across valleys and knows eyes once searched this same horizon, shoulders once tensed for the dart's release. The continuity runs thicker than time itself, as though the landscape holds impressions not erased but hidden under snow. These roots, etched invisibly into the Canadian North, remind us that hunting was never chaos. It was rhythm, ritual, awareness, even anticipation that bordered on inevitability. Wherever caribou walked, people followed, and wherever people stood, the ice remembered, freezing fragments of their presence to wait for us to listen once more. Imagine a morning long ago along such a route. The herd approaches, moving like a tide across the white plain. Hunters rise from concealment, atlatls ready, hearts aligned not just in tension but in confidence, because they know this is the place, the time, the pattern long studied and repeated. The moment of motion belongs to memory as much as chance. Perhaps in such a scene a dart broke as it hit, a shaft splintered, its fragment falling into snow at the very edge of the path. The hunt surged onward, the herd broke into fragments of movement, hunters shouting, animals scattering. In that chaos, objects vanished into ice, layers folding them into stillness where they would remain indefinitely. Now, centuries later, melted patches release those fragments at the very edges of the old roots. Archaeologists bend close and see proof of what the people remembered. These were indeed the places of movement, of chase, of survival. The roots were lines both physical and cultural, shaped and reinforced by success and repetition. Every discovered shaft is not only a tool, but a symbol pointing back to those invisible trails. They sketch for us the pathways hunters walked by day and night, defined less by geography than by time itself. The roots carried them from hunger into stability, and back again, in a cycle bound to the migrations of animals. This cycle runs forward in imagination even now. As one lies still, listening, the vision of endless ridges fills the mind. Vast horizons, herds shimmering against snow, hunters moving carefully along familiar pathways. Sound falls away until only breath is heard, shared between past and present in unbroken repetition. the long history of these hunting grounds lingers within the land, locked into ice fields like veins of memory. They are not forgotten, merely concealed until the moment of need. Today, as melting reveals the paths, the stories rise as naturally as mist on a cold morning, pulling us back into motion with the hunters who once lived their lives along these trails. The lesson of these routes does not vanish when the herd disappears over the horizon. It continues, carried forward by the footprints of memory. Every artifact re-emerging is not only an object but a waypoint, a spark reconnecting us to the living maps once carried in the hearts of those who relied on them more than breath itself. And so, the landscape stretches endlessly, both silent and speaking. Each ridge and snow patch holds its own story, every valley echoes with steps long faded, every migration still repeats its eternal course. All we must do is let the rhythm draw us in, following the hunters where they once walked, losing ourselves in their continuity. Now, imagine drifting farther, deeper, across that frozen geography. The faint prints of caribou mix with the memory of human feet, until they no longer separate but merge into one continuous path. This is the truth of the hunting routes. They are not merely lines on the ground, but lines inside existence, threading all life together across the frozen expanse. The story hidden in the ice does not end with the hunter-s movement across routes or the caribou-s predictability. What lingers even more deeply is what the ice itself has chosen to keep, as if it became the custodian of fragments too fragile for earth and air. These frozen patches have preserved details that almost feel impossible, pieces of lives and practices so delicate that they should never still exist. Yet they remain, untouched for 10,000 years, until now. Every artifact that slips from melting snow feels like a paradox. Here is a wooden dart shaft smooth as if sanded yesterday, yet older than cities. Here is a cord of sinew still wound tightly around its binding, even though millennia have passed in silence. Such preservation defies expectation, but in the chambers of perpetual frost, fragility becomes endurance. The smallest fibers survive where iron would rust away. Think of what is truly being uncovered. It is not only weapons, but the moments of their use and the fragments of their stories. A broken fragment of bone point tells of tension and failure in a chase, its splintered tip recording the instant when force exceeded strength. A scrap of hide may have slipped free in the frenzy of movement, detached from the shaft that once carried it further than hand or arm could throw. Layered in ice, these pieces slumbered in a stillness deeper than caves or soil could offer. While earth swallows objects with decay, the ice suspends them as if time itself had been asked to pause. No bacteria gnawed at fibers, no moisture fractured surfaces. Instead, the quiet cold sealed them in preservation, waiting for warmth to awaken their slumber. And warmth has finally returned. As climate shifts and mountain snow lines shrink, the ice yields what it once swore to keep hidden. Tools, clothing fragments, even traces of sewn stitches appear. Wood still bearing knife marks, sinew still twisted by practiced hands, fibers still pliant when first exposed, though they dry quickly once lifted into air. Each one is a fleeting miracle, a gift that begins dissolving the moment it is shared. This is why entire teams watch the ice so closely. Scouts climb ridges as soon as melt begins, searching for stray lengths of wood, twisted cords, or glints of bone near streams. Each find is carefully documented, wrapped, preserved, rushed to laboratories where climate control saves what little time remains. It is a race, one fought against the unstoppable force of change itself. The most astonishing discoveries are those that unveil human texture behind the weapon. A shaft still wrapped with the original sinew shows not merely what people hunted with, but how they built their tools with the finer work of their own bodies. Tendons twisted from animals fed not only bows and snares, but lashed darts with strength and durability. Without sinew, the wooden pieces would be incomplete. Such findings tell us more than design, they tell us about rhythm. To prepare a dart, a hunter not only carved and polished wood, he stretched tendons, soaked them, twisted them slowly until fiber became cord. The work was not a single moment of manufacture but a series of repeated tasks, interwoven into daily life until knowledge flowed like second nature. And still, these fragments surprise. Some appear with traces of adhesive resin clinging to shallow grooves in the shaft, evidence of glue binding before sinew wrapped over. This shows careful planning layered into design, technology stacked upon simplicity. Here is chemistry without laboratories, experimentation guided by sheer necessity. For researchers, these discoveries are among the rarest windows into organic technology. Stone alone cannot provide the whole picture, for it is too permanent. What remains here are the fleeting supports of everyday existence, the wood, the sinew, the hide. The ephemeral has been made eternal by frost, a miracle of coincidence and climate. It is through these fragile findings that we understand how complete ancient toolkits really were. We can see not only how a dart flew, but how it was placed together, balanced, tied, and reinforced. We can glimpse the order of work, from harvesting raw materials to finishing details. Each fragment carries labor upon labor, each thread a record of time spent in preparation for one instant of the hunt. Some finds extend even further into daily life. Along with weapons, small scraps of clothing once worn against the cold appear. Hide cut, pierced, or stitched with fibers reminds us that survival was more than the release of a dart. It was the warmth carried against the wind, shaped by human patience, by the attention poured into protecting life where cold threatened to end it. Such materials carry echoes of identity. A carefully smoothed shaft or a decorated binding suggests pride in craft, gestures of care that transcend necessity. Even when food and shelter demanded efficiency, the will to beauty endured. Perhaps symbols marked dart shafts to signal their owner, or perhaps lines were etched simply to take joy in detail. The artifacts whisper at these possibilities, though certainty retreats deeper than evidence. Still, there is enough insight to transform understanding. These rarely preserved objects illuminate the intimacy between material and maker. They show how hunters were artists of survival, combining strength with fineness, brute need with delicate craft. 10,000 years vanish when we hold such pieces in mind, because their beauty requires no translation across ages. The sheer volume still hidden within ice is both hope and dread. For every object already lifted, countless others remain sealed yet vulnerable, their time approaching swiftly as melting accelerates. What lies within might extend knowledge further still, entire garments, weapons intact, caches of tools. Each year that passes risks losing them before they are ever seen. Thus, every field season chases a balance between rescue and discovery. Teams move through ridges too isolated for permanent camps, racing storms and warm sun alike. Helicopters ferry finds back down before fibers desiccate in open air. Conservation experts prepare instantly, sealing items away as carefully as ancient ice once did. The work is harrowing but exhilarating, driven by reverence. To hold an artifact freshly peeled from snow is to cradle contradiction. On one hand, it is frail, on the verge of dissolving. On the other, it is resilient, having endured unthinkable spans unspoiled. Between these truths lies the wonder that grips researchers. Objects are both impossibly old and impossibly new. The ice itself tells us something profound in this odd generosity. It suggests that memory may survive where least expected, that fragility may prove the truest endurance. We tend to assume what lasts must be hard, stone, metal, bone. Yet in these mountains the softest things endure longest, because silence protected them with greater care. This idea lingers as we consider sinew twisted still in place, fibers still aligned, or fragments of hide that still show wear. These are whispers that lives were lived with care, that every moment of survival was a tapestry of countless tasks. No moment was isolated, no tool independent. All things were woven together like strands into cord. Listening to this, the mind drifts into the rhythm of preparation. The scraping of bone tools against wood to smooth a shaft. The tug of wet sinew stretching, twisting, turning to cord. The smell of resin softening over embers, sticky and pliant to seal joints. Each sound, each scent, fills the air, drawing the listener back into living presence. In these fragments, the forgotten heartbeat of ancient campfires pulses once again. Shadows flicker on hide shelters while hands work by firelight, crafting what the next day will need. Children watch, absorbing the sequence of motions that will one day pass to their own hands. Elders murmur, guiding, correcting, adding what years have taught. When the next morning arrives, the dart is ready. Carried along the ancient route already described, set in the notches of the atlatl, its bindings secure. A weapon perfected by tasks repeated through countless generations. When thrown, its flight carries not just the hunter's arm but the memory of all who shaped this knowledge before. This continuity survives inside the object itself. Taken from ice after millennia, it still retains the record of each stage. Grooves for sinew, glue residue, shaping of shaft, polish of surface. To modernize these are marks of manufacture, but to those who first made them they were marks of life. We see process, they knew survival. As listeners relax deeper into this unfolding, it becomes clear that the ice's greatest gift is not only preservation of matter, but preservation of intimacy. It returns not faceless relics but the small details of daily motions, the overlooked fragments that reveal everything. In these fragments we hear not abstractions but human breath, touch, decision. And perhaps this is why, when archaeologists first encountered these patches, they felt something instead of merely cataloguing. To lift a shaft felt like shaking hands across time. To cradle a sinew binding was to sense the warmth of fingers once pulling it tight. The artifacts become companions, not just specimens, granting closeness across impossible distance. The warmth of that realization contrasts with the cold that preserved it. But together they form the balance that defines this story, fragility enduring through ice, memory renewed through melt, silence carrying voice. What the ice patches leave us are not just tools, but the trace of humanity itself woven deep into frozen landscapes. And so, as you sink further into stillness, drifting with this story, the preserved relics float before you in calm procession. Darts dark with age yet intact, sinew twisted still, hide scraps curled but recognizable. They drift like fragments of dreams across a frozen expanse, reminding you that even the smallest traces may outlast empires if silence stands guard. Resting with these images, one feels the tenderness of time. The ice does not roar its history, it releases it gently, artifact by artifact, as though whispering instead of speaking. To follow this whisper is to follow the thread that ties fragility to survival, a thread that winds through sinew, wood, and hide, through humanity itself. The frozen hunting grounds teach us this truth, even the tiniest fragment holds all of life within it. The root set the stage, the hunters mastered their tools, but the ice collected their fragments patiently. And now, returned at last, they tell their stories once more, softly but clearly, like voices carried on the cold air of mountains. The ice speaks not only of hunters and their weapons, but of voices that never left the land, voices that carried memory through story, song, and ritual. Long before archaeologists walked the ridges, long before melting revealed shafts and sinew, the indigenous peoples of these northern ranges already knew the rhythms of the ground. Their knowledge was not hidden in snow, it was alive, spoken from elder to child across countless gatherings. To listen to those voices is to discover that roots, animals, and tools never vanished. They live within narratives told by firelight, within songs that encode migration paths, within ceremonies that honor the caribou who give life through their return. The oral traditions are not separate from the objects thawing from ice but are their continuation, a living archive parallel to the frozen one. Among the First Nations of the Yukon and Northwest Territories, stories describe the relationship between people and herds as a covenant. Caribou were regarded not merely as prey but as generous givers, respected in ritual, honored in memory. Successful hunts required not only skill and strength but humility toward the animals, humility that guided the future of survival. Generations carried forward ways of reading the land, ways invisible to outsiders. The tilt of moss, the bent track of snow, the sound of birds at ridge crests all spoke to hunters trained since childhood. Even without compass or map, they navigated flawlessly, because the land and their stories had already drawn the way forward. Each feature was never nameless, each was woven with significance. When archaeologists began uncovering artifacts preserved in ice, indigenous communities saw confirmation of what they had always known. These were not surprising revelations but affirmations of oral memory. Every dart, every fragment of sinew, echoed customs already described in stories, returning physical weight to truths long carried by words. Sharing knowledge between science and tradition deepened the meaning of discovery. Elders explained the context behind the finds, why certain ridges were favored, how caribou gathered there, how hunters balanced patience with respect during each chase. These accounts filled life into what artifacts alone could not explain. Frozen traces became full stories once voices joined them. Such collaboration reminds us that memory is multi-layered. Ice preserves material, while minds preserve meaning. Neither is complete without the other. Combined, they form a dazzling continuity stretching across the centuries, one physical, the other cultural, fusing into one flow of knowledge that speaks more powerfully than either could alone. Imagine a night long ago in a northern camp. The fire flickers against the hide walls while families gather close. Elders chant quietly, teaching children of the caribou's return, repeating lines that encode not only belief but geography. The young memorize through rhythm and song, hearing where animals arrive, where snow hardens, where ice patches rest. These teachings survive without script because they are renewed with each telling. Memory is not dependent on fragile paper, it rests in voices repeated faithfully. As long as story is told, the knowledge lives. The cycle becomes endless. Each season hunters walk the routes affirmed by song. Each generation inherits what already proved true. As a listener drifting now, you can feel that inheritance surrounding you. Voices murmur through frost, stories brush across the stillness of night, words preserved just as delicately as wood in ice. Both exist to remind us that no knowledge vanishes completely, that people and place are bonded more deeply than loss will allow. Respect for animals ties the stories tightly. Hunters knew that to take life one must give acknowledgement. Rituals offered thanks to caribou spirits, acknowledging their role as givers. Songs marked their migrations, their names spoken with reverence so that balance prevailed. It was not killing alone, it was relationship woven with care. This relationship explains why understanding remained intact for so long. The roots were not merely geography but sacred pathways binding humans to nature. To follow them was to step into cycles greater than oneself, to enact traditions that stretched back through endless winters. Every hunt therefore carried not just hunger, but responsibility. Modern scientists, hearing these oral accounts, realized their weight exceeded data alone. Artifacts confirmed the presence of hunts, but traditions clarified their meaning. The interplay between respect, ritual, and necessity explained why the hunts were sustainable. Communities did not overtake the herds, they lived alongside them, synchronized rather than antagonistic. These values resonate across time, echoing as clearly today as they did in ancient firelight. They remind us that survival is never only physical, it is also spiritual, moral, cultural. To live in balance with the frozen land required more than tools, it required a worldview built upon care. That care endures in indigenous voices still speaking today. Walking the high snowfields now, descendants still feel the presence of ancestors. Even if no animal appears, even if the wind strips the ridges bare, the stories remain imprinted, unmovable, bound to the earth itself. Each mountain knows its name in their language, each valley still recites its lesson. Human continuity lies not in artifacts alone but in the strength of voice. Imagine an elder pointing across a valley, saying quietly to a child, "Here, the caribou always return, here, hunters always stood ready." The child listens, repeating silently to themselves, storing this information in memory. Decades later, as an adult, they stand on the same ridge with the same knowledge flowing unbroken inside them. This is lineage made flesh. Now consider the frozen relics once thought lost forever, recovered in our century. A shaft of wood still bearing sinew, a fragment of hide still remembering stitches. When shown to indigenous elders, these fragments provoked not only awe but recognition. They were familiar, because the stories already described them. The frozen past matched the living present. Scientists may measure, photograph, and catalogue, but recognition of belonging reaches deeper. These tools are not merely artifacts, they are family heirlooms, ancestors' voices preserved in matter instead of sound. To handle them without respect is unthinkable, for they belong to the cultural family of those who remain. They carry identity more than statistics. This understanding shifts the meaning of research. The ice does not reveal curiosities, it returns pieces of heritage long cherished by indigenous nations. Each discovery is therefore more than intellectual, it is emotional, spiritual, communal. The hunters who lost those tools are not strangers, they are relatives whose gifts return in time of need. Partnerships have grown from this realization, with archaeologists working alongside local communities, guided by protocols of respect. Finds are not hidden away but shared with those whose traditions cradle them best. This form of collaboration represents not a loss to science, but a richer, fuller relationship between object, story, and people. For the listener resting into this narrative, imagine the weaving of two voices, the quiet release of fragments from ice, and the steady hum of oral history passed without interruption. One emerges suddenly, the other flows unceasingly, and together they produce harmony. That harmony is what allows us to walk back into the frozen hunting grounds as if they had never disappeared. In that harmony we see humanity's strength. Survival was not reached through tools alone, but through meanings and responsibilities layered around them. The hunters' atlatls did not exist without the songs that explained when to use them, without the rituals that returned balance, without the teachings that ensured continuity. Everything was bound into one cycle. Even now, as winter storms sweep the Yukon ranges, their songs feel carried on the wind. The howling becomes chorus, the snow becomes reminder, the land becomes a stage where memory still performs its truth. Nothing is lost, it only waits for ears that choose to hear. So the truth of the ice patches is deeper than archaeology. It is continuity of indigenous voices guiding us to understand what is preserved. The truth is that tools do not stand alone, they belong to people, and people belong to place, shaped as much by responsibility as by skill. It is one unbroken thread stretching forward. As you let this truth flow across your thoughts, the sounds of ancient chants blend with the silence of mountains once more. You hear footsteps, but they are accompanied by voices, teaching, remembering, never ceasing. You hear not an ending, but a continuation, and in that realization, the frozen landscape grows warmer with meaning. The ice preserved the tools, but the people preserved the knowledge. Together, they tell a story richer than either could alone. It is this meeting of frozen silence and living voice that makes the Canadian hunting grounds more than ruins. They are a presence, breathing softly even now across the ridges, never truly gone. And so the journey through this landscape carries you deeper into a sense of belonging. Hunters move, animals gather, tools fall, ice holds, scientists recover, elders remember, children listen. The cycle never broke, it continues even through you, now listening, now drifting, now becoming part of its pattern. This is why the patches remain extraordinary. They remind us that culture is not only in artifacts left behind, but in voices never silenced, traditions never forgotten. As snow falls silently onto ridges tonight, both memories endure together, blending seamlessly, carrying us closer across the divide of 10,000 years. The silence of the ice has begun to shift. Where once the ridges held their treasures in perfect stillness, the warmth of today reaches deeper than before. The ancient balance that kept wood, hide, and sinew preserved has started to bend under the weight of change, and what was once eternal is now fleeting. Streams run earlier in the season, sliding away across slopes that used to hold snow all year. Patches that once stood unmoved for centuries shrink in months, edges collapsing into runoff that pours down into the valleys. Every thaw exposes more, but each exposure is a danger, releasing objects into air that erodes them as swiftly as it reveals them. The paradox of discovery and destruction touches each artifact. A dart shaft emerges almost whole, its sinew bindings intact, only to crack and dry within days if not rescued. Hide softens as it thaws, briefly returning to flexibility, then hardens into brittle dust. The ice preserved with absolute patience, and the air dismantles with brutal speed. This is why urgency defines modern research. Teams scramble across ridges as soon as melting begins, racing against seasons that grow shorter and warmer every year. Helicopters drop them near the shrinking edges of patches, where they carefully search for fragments lying dark against the snow. There is no time for hesitation. Hours lost may mean centuries erased. The urgency is bittersweet, because each artifact is a wonder and a tragedy at once. To see wood polished by hands of 10,000 years past is breathtaking, but to watch it falter against sunlight and dryness is painful. Preservation becomes a battle fought against inevitability, a struggle that demands both devotion and speed. The hunters who walked here long ago could never have imagined this awakening. For them, the ice patches were constants, always present in seasonal rhythms, eternal as the caribou routes themselves. But today those rhythms falter, and the constancy is gone. What was background to their world now becomes endangered. Each new melt event uncovers more than just tools, it shifts our understanding of time itself. Where once discoveries came rarely, carefully lifted from occasional sites, now the output multiplies, as if thousands of years of memory are spilling out at once. We stand flooded by history, overwhelmed with more than we can gather. Scientists describe it as a library opening all its shelves at once, while a fire quietly burns across its stacks. You can see book after book revealed, yet you know you cannot save them all before flame takes them. That is the dilemma of the modern climate colliding with ancient preservation. And yet, even in this loss, the presence of these finds transforms how we listen. Each object may be fragile, but in its emergence it cries out louder. It reminds us not only of the ingenuity of hunters, but of the delicate threads that hold memory together. The ice patches show us endurance, but also impermanence, and in that intersection we discover lessons. The indigenous voices know this lesson already, speaking of respect toward the animals, toward balance in pursuit. Nature is not to be forced beyond limit, for imbalance leads to ruin. Now we see the same principle in climate itself, a reminder that disruption carries consequences greater than we anticipate. The relics are signals, warnings written in wood and hide. As seasons warm, hunters of the past reach back toward us through these fragmenting gifts. Each dart shaft reminds us that survival was once a collaboration with land. Each sinew cord shows the obligation to use only what is necessary, to waste nothing, to share balance. Ironically, they return at a time when those lessons are needed most. For archaeologists on the ridges, the work feels haunted with responsibility. They work not only in service of science, but as guardians, catching messages before they vanish. They kneel beside melting edges, brushing gently at patches of wood, lifting as delicately as though raising voices from silence. Every gesture carries reverence. Imagine kneeling there yourself, hearing the drip of meltwater, feeling the crisp air wrapped with warmth. Before you lies a weapon older than memory, soft against snow yet vulnerable in your own hand. You know you must protect it, yet also know you can only do so for a little while. That fragility is humbling. Conservation laboratories extend this race, designing chambers where humidity is controlled, where ancient wood can slowly adjust to air without splitting. Specialists work like healers, stabilizing sinew threads, sealing hide fragments, allowing objects to live long enough for study. Each object requires patience equal to the patience of ice. Even so, not every object can be saved. Some fall apart the moment they are lifted, collapsing into fragments too delicate for any intervention. Scientists catalogue as much as possible, photographing quickly, storing notes, preserving at least the memory of the object if not its material. Each loss is a quiet grief, a reminder that not all gifts can remain. This grief reflects the larger world beyond archaeology, the recognition that ice itself is vanishing. The patches are not infinite, they are shrinking. In centuries they endured unchanged, in decades they collapse. The hunter's frozen grounds, once eternal, are dissolving just as surely as the objects they protect. That truth makes their story resonant for today. The hunters survived by respecting patterns of nature, aligning with cycles rather than forcing them. Now, in our disruption of balance, we see the return of their memory as both wonder and warning. Their tools remind us of resilience, but their fate reminds us of fragility. The paradox lingers through every description. To hold a dart from the ice is triumph, but it is triumph born from crisis. To hear the voices of the past is joy, but it is joy colored by urgency. Our connection is strengthened at the very moment the connection itself risks vanishing forever. For the listener drifting in thought now, imagine the ridges as they melt. Streams of water weave across snow, revealing glimmers of wood, flashes of bone, threads of sinew frozen in new translucence. Slowly the ground returns its secrets, yet quickly the air claims them, scattering history across wind. In those moments, the mountains feel alive, like storytellers suddenly breaking their silence. For millennia they guarded artifacts wordlessly, now they speak in floods, in streams, in sudden revealings. The voices are loud not because they choose to be, but because their guardianship is ending. They speak because they must. This sense of urgency carries deep into the heart. The frozen grounds, once slow and eternal, are rushing forward, their stories tumbling out all at once. Each object you picture drifting into light reminds you that memory itself can be fragile, yet its release is powerful, undeniable. It commands attention even in sleep-esque quiet. So we surrender to this flow, following the rhythm of melt and memory. Hunters walk again, their tools surface, their voices return. The land gives back what it borrowed, gifting fragments of life at the edge of collapse. And we, listening, receive them with awe, even as they slip away again. The stillness of snow has broken into streams, but in its breaking, it passes forward its most precious contents. You hear them now, drifting through air like echoes of throws across frozen valleys. Even as the patches dissolve, their meaning gathers into permanence within our minds, unmelting, unforgettable. And so, though the warmth threatens what silence once preserved, the message remains. The hunters still teach, the ice still speaks, and the urgency itself becomes part of the story. For even in fragility, even in loss, their legacy endures, flowing like meltwater from frozen ridges into our waiting hands. The mountains tremble with small voices each summer when the sun leans longer across their ridges. For those who climb into the thin air with patience and careful eyes, each step becomes a search, each glance a possibility. Archaeologists arrive here not as conquerors of history, but as listeners bending closer, waiting for the ground itself to reveal words it has been holding for millennia. They walk in silence, their footsteps muffled by soft banks of snow melting into rivulets that trickle downward. Ahead, the retreating edge of an ice patch lies dark against the earth, a boundary where memories surface. To the untrained eye it seems like nothing more than melting snow, but to the practiced gaze it is a threshold into a world where time folds backward. One crouches low, brushing aside slush with a gloved hand, and something thin and brown lies revealed, a fragment of wood etched with straightness that betrays human touch. The breath catches, because this is no branch or stray twig, this is shaped, smoothed, fitted long ago into the hunt. The excitement is hushed, because the fragility is obvious. A rough touch, a careless lift, and 10,000 years of silence could collapse into dust. So the archaeologist steadies their posture, bends closer, and with brushes finer than those used by painters, they clear the snow away. Each sweep is deliberate, lifting meltwater slowly without disturbing the object's delicate fibers. Around them, the air stills, human heartbeat loud against immensity, as if the world knows to pause for this recovery. The wood emerges fully, intact in length, astonishingly well preserved. Its surface still polished under layers of frost, its edges still bearing grooves where sinew once wrapped itself tight. Even the faint residue of resin clings, proof that hands warmed it over fire before binding cord into secure place. The archaeologist whispers, though no one demands silence, because reverence insists upon it. Photographs are taken immediately before exposure dries the artifact. Each angle must be recorded, each texture catalogued, so that even if the material cannot be saved, its features live on in memory of images. Technology meets miracle here, science kneeling before silence, hoping to hold memory before it slips away again. Then comes lifting, the most dangerous moment. The wood, soaked with meltwater, lies soft and pliant, yet if it dries too fast, it will shatter into splinters. The archaeologist maneuvers carefully, sliding beneath with steady support, cradling the artifact in both hands. It is not a tool now, it is a fragile child of time, breathing its first air in countless centuries. Around them, the rest of the team gathers, or written into stillness. Each person knows this object will change understanding, will rewrite pieces of history once assumed lost. It is not imagination but reality, technology preserved entire, not theory, not sketch. They feel themselves standing at a bridge across ages. The artifact is placed in a protective container, humidity controlled, sealed before transport. Cold packs surround it, simulating the environment it grew accustomed to, allowing it time to adjust. What ice once did, now human science mimics, becoming caretaker for memory as it crosses into new life. The journey down to laboratories begins, but the ridge holds silence again, bereft of what it once secured. On another day, another ridge, a bone point appears, shining white against dark melt soil. Its tip is sharp still, its edges grooved where hafting once gripped it firmly. Again the archaeologist kneels, again hands brush the snow, again reverence fills the silence. Each object is treated not as curiosity but as sacred guest, welcomed back into presence. Some finds astonish in different ways: an entire dart, full shaft intact, bindings still visible, a marvel of survival. Such moments draw tears from hardened researchers, because the feeling is not merely professional. It is personal, intimate, the sensation of clasping hands with ancestors across a gulf too wide for words. Their voices tremble in the wind, faint but unmistakable. The mountains become alive with spirits in these moments. Each discovery feels less like finding something unknown and more like being entrusted with something left intentionally. As if hunters who once passed here long ago knew they were leaving messages, threads of continuity, waiting for their distant kin to discover them in a turning age. When dusk descends, the team rests at camp, the cold air growing sharper as the sun vanishes. The day's finds lie secured in containers, whispers of history cradled in foam and sealed lids. Around the fire, archaeologists speak softly, reflecting on the bond between science and soul, on how each artifact demands respect as much as description. Stories flow in camp, mingling modern wonder with indigenous wisdom. Elders accompanying the expedition remind them that these tools are not relics, they are relatives. Each dart shaft was carried by someone whose descendants still live, whose voices still remember. To treat the artifacts is to treat family, to honor them as beings, not objects. In that realization, the work itself transforms. Archaeologists no longer see themselves merely as researchers, but as caretakers joining older traditions. They are not extracting history, they are collaborating in continuity. The frozen voices are returning, but they belong to those whose stories never ceased, even when buried in ice. As you imagine this, you sense the intimacy of the setting. The fire flickers, faces glow orange against the blackness of night, and the mountains loom silent above. Yet between darkness and flame, voices bridge distances just as tools bridge centuries. There is peace in their words, humility in their shared labor. With each new dawn, the pattern repeats. The team ascends slopes, snow crunching under boots, eyes scanning constantly for the faintest sign. Sometimes they find nothing more than meltwater and stones. But other times they find that whisper of shape, and again the ridge yields its gift, and again humanity feels the weight of remembering. The accumulation of these finds tells us more than individual marvels. Each artifact is not coincidental but piece of a broader story of movement, patterns, lessons. Together they create maps of life traced across ranges. They reveal where hunters waited, where herds clustered, where survival unfolded in repeating chorus. In the laboratories far to the south, these objects undergo their own journey. Conservators watch endlessly, controlling moisture, preventing splits, cataloging with microscope small grooves invisible to the eye. They measure residue, sample fibers, extract insight, yet always with gentleness, always echoing the reverence of those who first lifted the tools from ice. The objects whisper in these settings too. Even under laboratory lights, even surrounded by sterile instruments, they hum with presence. Scholars studying them feel the pull of history close to their skin, as if the air itself thickens with memory. They take notes, yet they also pause, listening to the silence carried within sinew and wood. It is the silence that moves people most, the same silence preserved by snow for millennia. It is not emptiness but fullness, dense with life, requiring only patience to hear. Sitting with these objects, you hear hunters breathe, caribou move, children watch, elders teach. The noise of the present dissolves into the rhythm of the frozen past. And so, archaeologists do far more than uncover, they awaken. They awaken memory, awaken connection, awaken presence waiting in the fold of mountains. Each object reintroduced into the world is not only studied but honored, placed within a lineage that stretches forward as well as backward. The ice patches become chapels of time where reverence guides every step. Each season, their offerings are fewer but more urgent, and each artifact commands silence as though it were sacred text. We, listening from afar, are brought into that same reverence, feeling our hearts slow to match the patience of discovery. You can close your eyes now, and picture the ridges at dusk, melting patches glistening like silver pools beneath fading skies. A solitary figure kneels at the edge, lifting an artifact that has waited longer than memory. The silence is absolute, except for breath, except for heart. You watch it unfold, and you too join the reverence, held within the unbroken chain of time. The objects thawed from the ridges are more than remnants of tools, they are threads binding together people and their identity. Every dart shaft, every sinew wrap, belongs not only to history but to a living lineage of those whose ancestors shaped them. The frozen gifts are not distant curiosities, they are reflections of spirit, proof of belonging, tokens of memory still breathing today. To imagine them as mere artifacts is to miss their greater meaning. These are not anonymous weapons, not impersonal pieces of technology, but markers of cultural inheritance. They tell us not just how people survived but who they were, what relationships they held with the land, what rituals they carried, how deeply they saw themselves as part of a world they honored. When discoveries are shared with indigenous communities, recognition flickers immediately. A dart point is not described abstractly, it is seen as family. The traditions that kept knowledge alive see in these frozen relics a physical reminder of truths that never vanished. Continuity becomes tangible, the invisible stories gaining body through wood, hide, and stone. In gatherings where these artifacts are shown, the air grows heavy with reverence. Elders lean close, their voices steady but slowed, the same way voices soften in the presence of sacred beings. The young watch with silence, sensing this is not merely science but communion. The object in front of them carries the weight of combined centuries. There is pride in such moments, not pride in possession alone, but pride in the unbroken chain. Pride in the confirmation that the old ways remembered are not myths but witnessed fact, resurrected from ice. Pride in ancestors who endured in harshness, who carried balance with the herds, who left behind proof that memory and life were always entwined. Inside these objects breathes a reminder that culture is more than ritual and song, it is craft, it is practice embedded into survival. The polished surfaces of dart shafts show patience repeated until motion became perfect. A bone carved into fine point reveals artistry heavier than necessity. Function was never divorced from expression. This is where history transforms into identity. People look at the finds and see not only their past but their living present. They see ways of being that still persist, still define how communities relate to caribou, moose, and the land. They see foundation stones of culture that continue to shape life despite centuries of change. The effect is deep because colonial histories often suppressed these voices, tried to erase the presence of indigenous peoples from narratives of nations. But ice patches defy erasure, returning physical proof that these lands have always been shaped by care and intelligence. The frozen artifacts dismantle absence, insisting on presence. Each discovery carried carefully into museums becomes more than display, it becomes a point of recognition. Communities use them to teach, to pass on knowledge, to rekindle pride among children who see their ancestors not as shadows but as innovators. What once lay hidden now fuels strength, resistance, and renewal. Think of a young child standing in front of a preserved atlatl shaft, eyes wide as an elder explains that their ancestors threw such tools across mountain ridges. The child does not see an artifact behind glass, but sees possibility, guidance, a direct tie between themselves and those who once walked upon the same snow. Such ties fortify community identity. They transform memory into certainty, restoring dignity long undermined. They reveal that knowledge carried in oral traditions always stood firm, now accompanied by objects as if to say, here is proof, here is weight, here is the touch of your ancestors held intact through frost. The resonance is even deeper when one recalls the spiritual dimension of the hunt. Caribou were not prey alone, they were beings honored in ritual, treated as relatives who offered themselves. Artifacts connected to this relationship remind people of that balance, that bond of responsibility. To hold those tools is to feel again the sacred connection. Archaeologists who work alongside indigenous nations recognize that the objects do not belong solely to science. They belong to heritage, to communities still alive, still active. The proper place for them is in dialogue, shared as extensions of living identity. When treated in this way, they breathe again, no longer frozen in silence but alive in story. This dual existence, artifact and family, science and spirit, gives the objects extraordinary power. They refuse to stay confined in one dimension, but insist on complexity. They are evidence of technological genius, yes, but also of culture, philosophy, kinship. They are not merely tools for killing but tools for remembering. In this remembering, non-indigenous observers too are called into humility. They are asked to see the hunters not as remnants of a primitive past, but as human beings equal in ingenuity and depth to any culture across the world. They are asked to recognize that survival in frozen lands was not accident but skill layered with meaning. The authenticity of these discoveries strengthens indigenous voices in the modern world. When communities assert their heritage, they do so not in abstraction but with tangible artifacts beside them. These artifacts are companions in assertion, a chorus to words, insistently declaring, "We were here, we are here, we will always be here." Museums that host them now find themselves shifting. Glass cases become less about ownership than stewardship. Exhibitions grow collaborative, interpreted through indigenous leadership, translated into languages of ancestors, narrated with respect. Visitors no longer see detached finds but shared legacies. The objects beam identity outward. In this way, the ice patches are not only unfreezing artifacts, they are unfreezing voices. They are returning clusters of memory pressed down by centuries, reawakening not only researchers but entire cultures. The past strengthens the present shapes the future, and all three bind together seamlessly. For listeners now drifting deeper into stillness, imagine standing in a lodge where these old tools are being viewed today. Elders sit in circles, children part the silence with questions, archaeologists step aside with respect. On a table lies a dart shaft carried from ice, and around it flows warmth, laughter, reverence. The feel is not one of death or distance, but of reunion. The tool is greeted as if an ancestor had stepped through the door, welcomed back after a long and patient absence. It is embraced with gratitude, kissed with words of recognition, folded back into family. The ice has returned a relative, not an artifact. Such scenes continue again and again wherever discoveries are shared. Each time they repair threads that history once strained. Each time they bind memory tighter, ensuring it endures. Each time they give strength to communities still carrying respect for the land, still protecting caribou roots, still maintaining rhythm with the natural cycles of the mountains. The lesson is profound for all who listen. Our true heritage is not one of possession but of relationship, of stories passed faithfully even when silence tried to suppress them. Identity is not lost as long as fragments survive, whether in voices or in frozen shafts of wood. Each reinforces the other, each ensures survival of more than bodies but of culture itself. Identity weaves itself like sinew across time, binding generations the way cord once bound stone to shaft. Invisible strands keep us whole, even when stretched thin. And as long as one memory remains, the connection holds, unbreakable despite all attempts to sever it. The ice patches simply remind us of the strength always flowing inside. As you rest with this image, see the hunters again, but see not only their actions. See their meaning, their belonging, their identity carried across ridges. Picture their campfires as places where stories carried just as much weight as tools. Picture their descendants still speaking those words, still holding those meanings in circle today. The frozen hunting grounds show us continuity not abstract but immediate. From hunter to artifact, from artifact to community, from community to identity renewed. The chain is unbroken, and in that unbrokenness lies strength greater than any single object or story could offer. Strength that flows steady across 10,000 years. This is why the ice matters so deeply. It does not only uncover old tools, it restores entire identities, reminding us that heritage never truly vanishes. Even through silence, even through absence, the voices remain, waiting to be heard again. The ice releases them at the moment they are needed most. And so you breathe more slowly, sinking into the rhythm of this truth. Artifacts drift before you, but they glow now not as objects but as kin, as symbols of unbroken ties. They hum with presence, whispering of family, carrying endurance through every fiber. They will remain, if not in ice, then in the hearts and stories of those who remember. The frozen hunting grounds have carried us far, across an immense stretch of time, across landscapes where silence has hidden memory for 10,000 years. We have walked with hunters on ridges, felt their breath in cold air, held their atlatls poised against the flight of caribou. We have followed their routes, knelt beside their tools, and listened to voices that were never truly lost. Each fragment revealed from the ice has spoken, softly yet powerfully, reminding us that survival was not only about tools but about relationships. Relationships with animals, with land, with spirit, and with each other. The hunters who cast their darts long ago lived through bonds wider than themselves, teaching us that existence flows within cycles greater than individual lives. The ice taught us patience, preserving what soil would never allow. In its silence it held evidence of craft, lines of sinew wrapped carefully, shafts carved smooth by firelight, bone polished to points precise and functional. It held the tenderness of preparation, the humanity in each groove, the intimacy of hands working with knowledge repeated across generations. We learned also that nothing preserved remains untouched forever. The warming air has begun to ease open the libraries of ice, spilling their contents onto ridges with urgency. What was once permanent now dissolves quickly, giving gifts and warnings at the same time. The relics tell us not only of the past but of the fragility of the future. Voices of indigenous peoples filled the silence, showing us meaning beyond material. Oral traditions carried memory through centuries, keeping alive the knowledge that science only recently confirmed. The caribou's return, the sacred roots, the responsibility of hunters, these truths never vanished, they only waited for others to listen. When archaeologists and communities work together, something extraordinary happens. The artifacts are no longer inert finds, but relatives return to families that still exist. They are seen as kin, honored with ceremony, spoken to with reverence, embraced with pride. They become more than evidence, they become living identity. Through this journey we have felt time itself stretch, fragile yet intact. A dart flown in the Paleolithic still carries the breath of its thrower into our present. A hide fragment still reminds us of warmth around an ancient fire. These are not echoes too faint to hear, they are voices vibrant, still resonating through frozen threads. The landscape itself becomes more alive in memory. Valleys once thought empty now bustle again in imagination, full of herds and hunters, of smoke rising from shelters, of footsteps marking trails. Every ridge becomes layered in meaning, layered in continuity. The snow no longer hides emptiness but conceals abundance. As you listen now, drifting deeper into calm, the rhythm pulls you into that continuity. The crunch of snow beneath ancient feet merges with the quiet hiss of modern winds. The hunters are not gone, they are walking beside us, their tools carried back into present time, their presence stitched into mountain silence. There is a serenity in realizing we are part of that unbroken chain. Though the tools lay in ice for ages, though centuries passed without knowing their stories, we are still bound together. Nothing has severed that thread, not time, not silence, not distance. The frozen hunting grounds prove this truth beyond argument. To hold this story within is to feel both humility and wonder. Humility that such endurance exists, wonder that we are allowed to witness it. These objects waited for us, but they did not wait for us alone. They waited to reconnect people to themselves, to restore what should never have been fragmented. It is here in the closing of this journey that gratitude takes form. Gratitude for the hunters who carved their tools with patience. Gratitude for the animals who gave life so that humans might endure. Gratitude for the mountains that sheltered memory under blankets of snow. Gratitude for the voices that never stopped speaking. Now, as the story draws to its resting place, imagine once more a hunter standing against endless white. He exhales into air that holds his breath as frost, he grips his atlatl, he waits with certainty born of wisdom. Around him the world hums with silence, balanced between stillness and motion, survival and respect. In his presence, you feel the timelessness of being. The dart leaves his hand, arcs across frozen space, and disappears into history. But history does not trap it there. The ice carries it forward, patient, until it finds us here. It lands not only in snow but in our understanding, reminding us that survival is built from ingenuity, reverence, and belonging. So we stand at the close of this long path, surrounded by snowfields of memory, hearing still the voices of hunters, of animals, of mountains. Their echoes linger softly in the background, rocking us gently into rest. The frozen grounds remain alive, whispering truths without end, even as we drift toward sleep. Thank you, dear listener, for walking these frozen ridges with me tonight. Thank you for letting your imagination step across time, for breathing beside the hunters, for touching the silence of the ice. May the story cradle your rest, may the rhythm of memory guide your dreams, and may you wake with the strength of knowing that nothing is ever truly lost. Good night, and may the frozen hunting grounds carry you into peaceful dreams, where the breath of ancient hunters joins your own, and the silence of the mountains becomes the music of rest.